Hello, welcome to the session on biographical sketch of Zeno. Zeno was the logician of the Eleatic school of Greek philosophy. Our primary source on the life of Zeno is Plato's Parmenides, Aristotle's Physics, and Diogenes Laertius' Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. Plato describes a visit of Zeno to Athens and his discussion with Parmenides and Socrates. At that time, Parmenides was about 65, Zeno was 40, and Socrates was much younger. If we assume the age of Socrates at that time is 20 and taking the date of Socrates' birth as 469 BC, we can very easily fix the date of birth for Zeno as 490 BC. We know from Plato's words that Zeno was tall and fair and was loved by Parmenides. Aristotle states that Zeno is the inventor of dialectics. Parmenides tries to prove his theory of being on a priori grounds, but Zeno tried to prove the non-existence of the many by his dialectic. Diogenes says that Zeno was born in Aelia, at present in southern Italy, as the son of Teleutogorus and adopted son of Parmenides. He also said that Zeno was a universal critic who has the skill to argue on both sides of any question. He also tells us that Zeno was arrested due to political reasons and was perhaps killed at the hands of a tyrant of Aelia. Apollodorus remarks in the Chronicles that Zeno was enthusiastically engaged in the politics at his time. He wished to overthrow the tyrant named Nearchus, but was arrested. He bit on to tyrant's ear and ridiculed the tyrant's friends. Antisthenes in his Successions says that after naming the tyrant's friends, he was asked by the tyrant if there was anyone else, and he said, "You are the one who has sinned against the city." To all the people who were present, he said, "I am shocked by your cowardice, that for fear of the things which I suffer, you would be slaves to a tyrant." And finally, biting off his own tongue, he spat it at him. Zeno has written 4 books: the Attacks, Epicuremata, the Disputations, Treatise on Nature, and Against the Philosophers. But unfortunately, none of them survive intact. Only fragments of Epicuremata have survived. In his Parmenides 128 d6, Plato makes Zeno say that his major work was written in his youth. All the other writings were written after it. Plato gives us a clear picture about the content of Zeno's youthful work. It contains certain discourses arranged in several sections, each deal with the statements of his opponents and his refutations. Our knowledge about Zeno's concept of the one and the many depends on the writings of Simplicius. His main contribution, the arguments against motion, has been preserved by Aristotle. In his commentary on Plato's Parmenides, Proclus states that Zeno produced not less than 40 arguments revealing contradictions, but very few of them are now known. Background and method of Zeno's philosophy. Metaphysical position. The first Greek school of philosophy, the Ionians, held the view that the first principle is matter. The second Greek school, the Pythagoreans, declared that it is number. Matter is something which is qualified and number is that which is quantified. The first 2 Greek schools have thus recognized quality and quantity as the first principles respectively. The third Greek school is Eleatics, to which Zeno belongs as logician. Parmenides and Zeno are the main thinkers of the Eleatic school. They have questioned the very foundation of Ionian and Pythagorean schools by refuting both the substance and quantity of reality. W.T. Stays in A critical history of Greek philosophy observes that the Eleatic thinkers have refuted the self-substantiality of existence. Zeno, who is regarded as the precursor of the Eleatic philosophy, argues that all is one. Parmenides developed this into the philosophical position that one alone is real and plurality and change are unreal. But human experience asserts that plurality and change are real. Parmenides therefore claims that the experience of reality, the one, is a matter of intuition, whereas the experience of unreality, plurality and change is given by senses. Melissus and Zeno, the dialecticians of the Eleatic school, tried to defend this metaphysical position. While Melissus attempts to give positive proofs, Zeno offers negative proofs by showing the absurdity of the opposites. For this, he employed a logical method, Zeno's method. This logical method is known as reduction ad absurdum. Literally, it means reducing to absurdity. Zeno is perhaps the first logician who applied this method in the history of Western logic. This is a deductive method in which we derive two sets of contradictory conclusions from a given postulate. The absurd status of this method gives rise to many paradoxes. Paradoxes. The Greek prefix para stands for against and doxa for opinion. A paradox is a contradictory belief or opinion. In a paradox, either the principles of reasoning or the assumptions on which it is based are false. Zeno formulated many paradoxes to refute the opponents of Parmenides. Proclus enumerated 40 Zenonian paradoxes. Each paradox leads us to self-contradictory position. For example, let us take Zeno's argument against plurality. Plurality is a collection of units. It means that plurality is divisible. If so, it must be infinitely divisible. For this, it must have certain magnitude. Any magnitude is divisible into parts which are still magnitudes and so themselves divisible, howsoever small. But if this is the case, then there cannot be anything which can be called a unit, because anything that one takes can still be divided and hence cannot be a unit. This leads to the fact that since plurality is a plurality of units, there can be no plurality at all. Arguments against plurality. General structure of antinomy. The general understanding about plurality is based on the notion that there are discrete entities or units or ones that exist independent of others. Zeno challenged this notion by arguing that these discrete units cannot be proved logically. To substantiate this point, Zeno gives us the argument called like and unlike, which is in fact an antinomy that runs as follows. If things that are many, they must be both like and unlike, but this is impossible. For unlike things cannot be like, nor can like things be unlike. Parmenides 127c. This argument can be understood in the following way. If there are many things, there must be at least two things, A and B, that differ from each other. Here, A differs from B in at least one way, but B is not different from A. This shows that A is both like and unlike. Similarly, B differs from A in at least one way, but A is not different from A. Therefore, B is both like and unlike. To say that a thing is both like and unlike is self-contradiction, and therefore the original statement that there are many things entails contradiction. In order to avoid this contradiction, we must admit that things are not many but one. Plato says that Zeno's arguments were all directed against plurality. But as we said earlier, Proclus tells us that Zeno elaborated 40 different paradoxes against different themes such as plurality, motion, place and sense of hearing. We need not blame Plato for having stated thus, for it is very much clear that all of them are directed against plurality. For example, motion requires a plurality of times and places, and therefore Zeno's arguments against motion is actually an argument against plurality as well. However, the classification made by Kirk and Raven in the pre-Socratic philosophers seems to be more legible than Plato's account. This study says that Zeno raised 40 arguments against plurality and 4 arguments against motion. Of the 40 arguments against plurality, 2 are very significant and hence they are given below. First one, the argument from large and small. It states that one who accepts that there are many things in the world must also admit that these many things are both large and small. They are A. So large as to be unlimited in size, B. So small as to have no size. Zeno first proves that many things are small and then that they are large. The proof of B thus comes first and then only the proof of A. But it is problematic. Zeno says that each thing is same as itself and one, therefore nothing has size. To say that nothing has size is to say that nothing exists, because anything without size, thickness or bulk does not exist. If nothing exists, then it contradicts with the A, which asserts unlimited size of things. The argument from limited and unlimited. It states that if there is a plurality, it must contain both a finite and infinite number of components. Finite because they have to be neither more nor less than they are. Infinite because if they are separate, there will be others between them, and yet others between them ad infinitum. To avoid this infinite regress, we must admit that there is no plurality. Arguments against motion. The logical foundation of Zeno's paradoxes. Zeno introduced 4 arguments against motion. These are the racetrack, the Achilles, the stadium and the arrow. Aristotle discusses all of them in physics. Each one needs to be learned separately, but they can be better understood as arguments against 2 types of assumptions about motion. Any concept of motion depends on the nature of space and time. In ancient Greece, 2 opposed views of space and time were prevalent. Either space or time are infinitely divisible or indivisible. In the former case, motion is continuous and smooth flowing, whereas in the latter case, motion is discrete. Lee calls it cinematographic and Kirk and Raven explain it as succession of minute jerks. Zeno's argument against motion are in fact arguments against these 2 assumptions about space and time. The first 2 arguments are against the former view, the last 2 against the latter. The 4 arguments can be understood as 2 pairs on the basis of these assumptions. The first member of each pair tries to prove that motion is impossible for a single body. The second member tries to prove that it is impossible for more than one body. The first is used in the absolute sense, while the second in the relative sense. Each one is described as follows. First one, the racetrack or the dichotomy. It is impossible to cross the stadium because before you reach the far end, you must first reach the halfway point. Before you reach the halfway point, you must reach the point halfway to it, and so on ad infinitum. Here the argument clearly shows its denial of the assumption of space as continuity. If space is infinitely divisible, any finite distance contains an infinite number of points. Therefore, it is impossible to reach the end of an infinite series in a finite time. This argument is also known as the dichotomy because it divides the magnitude in half. This argument can be explained in the following way. If A and B are different points in space, to move from A to B, one has to first reach A1, the halfway between A and B. The one has to move from A1 to B. For this, one must first reach A2, that is the halfway between A1 and B. There are an infinite number of steps such as A1, A2, etc. and an infinite number of halfway points A1, A2 and so on. But it is impossible to cross an infinite number of distances, that is, to come into contact with an infinite number of points. This shows that the movement from A to B cannot be completed. Therefore, motion is impossible. Second one, the Achilles and the tortoise. This is the most famous and debated argument in Zeno's dialectics. While the dichotomy is concerned with the motion of one body, the Achilles is concerned with the relative motion of two bodies. Unlike the dichotomy, it never divides the magnitude in halves. Zeno explained this argument with the help of the race between Achilles and a tortoise. Achilles presents the fastest and tortoise represents the slowest. The name Achilles is taken from Greek tragedy the Iliad, wherein he is depicted as the fastest runner. Tortoise is the slowest animal in the common parlance. Therefore, the story speaks about the race between the fastest and the slowest. Aristotle sums up the result of their race. The slowest will never be caught by the fastest because the pursuer must first reach the point where the pursued departed. So the slowest must always be some distance in front. The argument runs as follows. Achilles will never catch the tortoise even though he runs faster than the tortoise. By the time he reaches the tortoise starting point A, the tortoise will have moved some distance, however small, to a new point A1. By the time Achilles reaches A1, the tortoise will have moved on to a further point A2 and so on. Each time Achilles reaches a point where the tortoise has been, the tortoise is no longer there. The tortoise is always ahead and so Achilles never catches up. Aristotle says that this argument is essentially same as the argument of the dichotomy, but it may be pointed out that Aristotle is wrong when he says that Achilles will never catch the tortoise. The word always and never do play an important role here. Achilles never catches up because the tortoise is always ahead. In Zeno's description of the argument, there is always a sense of tortoise one-step advancement in the race. Whenever Achilles reaches a particular station where the tortoise was there before, the tortoise is still ahead. But in another sense, the tortoise is not always ahead. For example, if Achilles moves 1000 feet per minute and the tortoise moves 100 feet per minute, the tortoise will no longer be ahead. But this is not the intention of Zeno to convey. For Zeno, the Achilles has not caught up at the end of any stage of the race. But not that he never catches up, because there is no final stage in both the arguments. Third, the moving arrow. By this argument, Zeno wants to prove that the view space is discrete is groundless. Aristotle in his Physics 6.9, 239b, 5-7 restates this argument. A moving arrow is motionless since even in moving an arrow occupies a space equal to itself. This may be explained in a syllogistic form as follows. First one, if something occupies a space equal to itself at time t, it is at rest at t. Second one, at each instant now of its movement, an arrow occupies a space equal to itself. Third, at each instant now of its movement, the arrow is at rest from 1 and 2. Fourth, What is moving is always at a now. The entire duration of its motion consists of instants. 5. An arrow is at rest during the whole of its flight. Look at the diagram. Each row occupies a space equal to itself. The two odd phrases in the now and occupies an equal space are very interesting. Jonathan Barnes observes that the now is Aristotle's standard term for an instant of time. But in Zeno's argument, it makes no sense to say that A is at t, where t names some instant. For example, I may be in a place, but I cannot simply be at a time. We must therefore understand this term as something referring to existence and not time. Barnes also observes that the phrase occupies an equal space means a space equal to its volume, and therefore in the first premise of Zeno's logic it would simply mean a space equal to its volume. Barnes concludes that the bodies of creatures measure out their place. McCrahen observes that the first statement implies that if something is not at rest, then it does not occupy a space equal to itself. In that case, it may occupy space larger than itself. This means that if something is in movement, it occupies a space larger than itself. If this is so, then Zeno claims that things in motion stretch. That is to say, things move like a rubber band. For example, things originally move from A to B, then stretches to extend from C to D. This also would mean that the distance between A and B equals the distance between C and D and is less than the distance between A and D, since there is stretching. It is to be noted that Aristotle does not admit that motion can take place at an instant. For Aristotle, motion occurs over an interval of time, but for Zeno, motion could be the series of instants. Aristotle argues that since rest is the absence of motion, rest takes place over intervals. Therefore, it is impossible to be at rest at an instant than it is to move at an instant. This Aristotelian argument is refuted by McCrahen as follows. We do not talk about both motion and rest at an instant. For example, consider the statement, I was caught in a traffic jam from about 8:10 until about 8:20. Here, the sentence is not a nonsense but states something that occurs at an instant. Aristotle raises an important question with regard to the fourth premise. The flying arrow is at different points at different instants or nows, but how does it move from one point to another? Aristotle argues that if Zeno's position that time is composed of nows is correct, then time is atomic. If time is atomic, then there are adjacent instants. If something is in motion, it occupies different places at different instants. If T1 and T2 are successive instants, something in motion over the interval T1, T2 occupies different places dt1 and dt2 at those instants. But when does it move from dt1 to dt2? There is no answer since there is no time, no instance between T1 and T2 to take place. Aristotle solves this paradox by denying that time is made up of nows. Since time is continuous, there are no adjacent instants. Since motion also is continuous, there is a one-to-one correspondence between the instants during the arrow's flight and the positions it occupies during its flight. The stadium. The theme of the fourth argument is about equal bodies moving in a stadium alongside equal bodies in the opposite direction. This argument can be understood with the help of two diagrams. Each diagram contains 3 rows, each containing an equal number of equal-sized objects or bodies. The following diagram represents the starting point of the movement. A. Stationary bodies, B. Bodies moving between D and E, C. Bodies moving from E to D. D. Beginning of stadium. E. End of stadium. Here, the A's are stationary. B's and C's are moving in the opposite directions with the same velocity. They will come to occupy the following position. Zeno explains that the leftmost C passes all 4 B's, while the rightmost B passes only half the A's, only 2 A's, and also all 4 C's. From this fact, Zeno infers that the time the rightmost B takes to pass the 2 A's is the half as long as the time the leftmost C takes to pass all 4 B's. This means that the time of their passage must be equal. Now, we are in the absurd conclusion that the half of a certain time is equal to the whole of that time. Zeno's influence and relevance. When we look at Zeno's arguments from the lens of a modern educated man, it would seem to be groundless and ludicrous. But the point to be noted is that Zeno was the father of dialectic, as Aristotle confirms it. Above all, his reasoning was long before the rules of logic were formulated in Greek thought. His reductio ad absurdum remains to be a convincing method of proof even in symbolic logic in the modern times. Viewed from that perspective, his contribution was immensely rich and profound. Following are some of the points to be noted as the impact that Zeno has had on various philosophers. First one, scholars like Tannery 1885 argued that Zeno's arguments were against Pythagorean doctrine that reality is fundamentally mathematical and everything can be measured by units. But Lastos 1967 and others refute this point. They held the view that Zeno's intention was to challenge the common sense understanding of plurality and motion. Aristotle states that Zeno's logic convinced the atomists to assert that matter has got smallest indivisible parts. 3. Whitehead's process theory has been influenced by Zeno's paradoxes. Whitehead appreciated Zeno's point that space and time are not points or instants structured as mathematical continuum. Fourth, the logical atomist Bertrand Russell's analysis of the problem of infinity, which he historically sketched, has been influenced by Zeno's paradoxes. Now, let me move on to summarize today's session. Zeno is one of the greatest logicians in the history of philosophy. He has introduced the logical method called reduction and absurdum and formulated many logical paradoxes. His aim was to establish the monistic position of Parmenides that reality is only one and plurality and motion are unreal. To establish this, Zeno introduced the famous paradoxes called the dichotomy or racetrack, the Achilles and tortoise, the moving arrow and the stadium. All these paradoxes have questioned the human understanding of the world. Now please try to answer some questions. Prepare a note on life of Zeno. Write a note on the context in which Zeno introduced his paradoxes. Discuss the major types of paradoxes. Critically analyze Zeno's metaphysical position in connection with his logic. What are the ways in which paradoxes will help us to understand the world? Discuss the contributions of Zeno to the world of Greek philosophy. Is there any logical relation between the paradoxes of plurality and motion? Examine with reference to Zeno's paradoxes. Now, books for further reading. The Pre-Socratic Philosophers by Jonathan Barnes, Routledge, London, 1982. A History of Philosophy, Volume 1, Greece and Rome by Frederick Copleston, Image Books, New York, 1950. The Texts of Early Greek Philosophy, the Complete Fragments and Selected Testimonies of the Major Pre-Socratics, Part 1, by Daniel W. Graham, Cambridge University Press, Cambridge, 1983. A History of Greek Philosophy, the Pre-Socratic Tradition from Parmenides to Democritus, Volume 2 by W. K. C. Guthrie, Cambridge University Press, Cambridge, 1993. The Pre-Socratic Philosophers, A Critical History with a Selection of Texts by G. S. Kirk and J. E. Raven, Cambridge University Press, Cambridge, 1977. The Central Philosophy of Buddhism, A Study of Madhyamika System by T. R. V. Murthy, HarperCollins Publishers, New Delhi, 1998. Well, thank you for watching today's program. Hope today's session was enriching. Goodbye.